Wyoming, 1888. A sky the color of a bruise stretched over the valley, yellow-gray, pressurized, holding its breath. Below, the town of Hunquirky burned its lamps and laughed at the woman on the mountain. 4 miles up the ridge, she was still working, alone, hands bleeding, a child asleep inside the stone. The animals had already fled. Every bird, every deer. The creek itself had gone quiet in a way that had no name, but that every living thing understood. In the saloon below, men raised their glasses. Someone had written her name in a betting book. The odds were 20 to 1 she wouldn't survive Christmas. She knew something they didn't. The mountain knew it, too. And somewhere in the dark, above the valley, in a place where the earth ran warm at 54 degrees through every season, through every storm, through every certainty men had ever built and lost, the water kept moving. It had been moving for 1,000 years. It was not going to stop now. The winter of 1930 had settled over Wyoming like a judgment long delayed. Silas Drummond sat on the porch of the house his son had built, 90 years old and still upright, in the way of men who have outlived their certainties, whose bodies forget how to quit even when the rest of them has accepted the reckoning. His left hand rested on his knee. His right hand belonged to Harlan Jr., who stood beside him without speaking, because Harlan Jr. had learned decades ago that some silences were load-bearing. On that right hand, 3 fingers ended at the second knuckle, smooth, pale, permanent. The boy, 12 years old and full of the particular hunger that age carries before the world has taught it caution, pointed up toward Stoneback Ridge, toward the bronze plaque that caught the winter light even at this distance, even after all these years. "Grandpa," the boy said, "who was she?" Silas did not answer immediately. He looked at Harlan's hand on the railing. He looked at the mountain. He looked at the sky the way old men look at skies, not for weather, not anymore, but for something that has no name, yet takes up all the space behind the eyes when a man has lived long enough to understand what he threw away. "Sit down, son." The boy sat. "The proudest thing I ever did in my life," Silas said, "was admit I was wrong." He pulled his coat tighter against the cold that had never stopped meaning something different to him since December of 1888. It took a blizzard, a Norwegian widow, and 18 dead neighbors to teach me that. 18, in a town of fewer than 200. He was quiet for a long moment while the snow came down in the gray afternoon light. Her name was Ingrid Voss. This is the story of what she built, what we destroyed, what she saved anyway, because that was the kind of a woman she was. He closed his eyes. The story came back to him the way it always did. Not in order, not cleanly, but in images, in cold. In the smell of warm earth where no warm earth had any business being. In a place where the mountain gave heat freely, asking nothing in return except that someone be wise enough to receive it. He started at the beginning. The beginning was not the storm. The beginning was a man named Eric Voss dying in a cabin on the eastern edge of Carbon County in the 3rd week of March 1888, refusing to tell his wife how bad it had gotten until he had finished what he came to finish. Eric Voss was a hydrological engineer for the Great Northern Railway, which meant he understood water the way a surgeon understands the body, not the surface of it, not the visible mechanics, but the deep current underneath, the hidden architecture where things ran constant despite the chaos above. He had come to Wyoming 7 years before with a specific idea lodged in his mind like a splinter that would not dislodge itself no matter how the seasons turned. The idea had come from his grandfather, a man who had lived to 91 in a house built into the side of a northern mountain, a house that grew vegetables in January, a house where livestock survived winters that killed everything left in the open valley below, a house that breathed with the earth rather than against it. Eric had spent those 7 years walking the high country of Carbon County with his instruments and his journals, measuring spring temperatures and barometric pressures and soil compositions, searching for the place where the earth gave heat freely, where water ran without freezing, where the right stone formed the right shelter and the geometry of the terrain itself would do the work that no amount of expensive lumber could accomplish. He filled journal after journal with numbers and drawings and calculations that no one in Harlow Creek would have understood or cared to understand. The men of that town built upward against the sky, against the wind, with the confidence of people who had never yet been shown the specific shape of their error. Eric Voss built downward in his mind for 7 years, patient as the earth itself, measuring what was actually there rather than what he wished were there. In the autumn of 1887, he found it, a north-facing slope on Stoneback Ridge, 4 miles from Harlow Creek, a natural cave system formed by ancient water moving through granite over time no human calendar could contain. A geothermal spring running at 54 degrees year-round, steady as a heartbeat, fed by heat from so deep in the earth that surface seasons meant nothing to it. A terrain that funneled winter winds into massive snowdrifts that would serve as a natural insulating blanket over the entrance. The cold itself becoming armor against the cold. He documented everything. He drew every measurement. He calculated the costs, under $200 for materials, 3 months of labor, and designed every element of what he called, in the careful English of a man who had learned the language as a child, but still sometimes dreamed in another, the mountain home. Then the fever found him. What Ingrid did not know, what she could not have known until she reached the final pages of his journal, was that Eric had felt it coming 3 weeks before he told her. He had felt it the way a man who lives close to his own body feels something wrong moving through him like a tide, slow at first, then less slow. He had made a choice. He continued his survey work through the first weeks of that tide, completing his measurements, finishing his drawings, writing his final calculations in the careful hand of a man who knows he is writing them for someone else to use. He chose the work over the warning. He chose Ingrid's future, Petra's future, over whatever future he himself had left. He finished. Then he came home. Then he told her. He died 11 days later. Ingrid sat beside him through all 11 of those days. She held his hand when he was lucid. She bathed his face with cool water when the fever climbed past reason. She kept Petra back from the doorway, shielding the girl from what a dying man looks like in the final stages, answering her daughter's questions in a voice that gave nothing away. Petra was 6 years old, with hair the color of winter wheat and her father's eyes dark, still, watchful. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom with her rag doll pressed to her chest and asked, with the terrible directness of children, when Papa was going to wake up. On the 9th day, the fever broke briefly. Eric's eyes cleared. He reached for Ingrid's hand with a grip that surprised her with its strength, pressed his leather journal into her palm. "I found it." His voice was scraped thin by 11 days of fever. He barely there at all. "Everything is in here. The spring, the cave, the calculations." His grip tightened. "Promise me you'll build it. Promise me you'll keep Petra safe." Ingrid looked at the journal. She looked at her husband's face, which was the face of a man who had already gone most of the way somewhere else and was staying only long enough to hear her answer. "I promise," she said. Eric died on the 11th day in the early morning, before the light had fully come into the room. Ingrid sat with him for a long time after. Then she got up, washed her face, and began to organize what needed to be organized. The ground was still frozen. No one in Harlow Creek offered to help the foreign widow bury her husband on the hillside overlooking the valley. She dug the grave herself with a pickaxe and a determination that left her hands bleeding by the 3rd hour. Petra stood beside her in the cold, not crying, still not fully understanding that her father was never coming home. When it was done, Ingrid knelt in the frozen earth and pulled her daughter close. "Papa left us something," she said. "He left us a way to be safe." She stayed in the cabin 3 days after the burial. She sat at the rough wooden table and read Eric's journals from the first page to the last, including the pages she had not known to look for, the pages that told her what he had not said aloud, the pages that told her about the fever he had felt coming, the choice he had made. She read those pages twice. Then she sat for a long time with her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing. When she rose, she packed Petra into the wagon, hitched their 4-horse Fjellsy to the traces, and drove into Harlow Creek to buy the only piece of land no one else wanted. The land office occupied the back corner of the First Bank of Harlow Creek, and Mayor Harlan Cott ran both institutions with the same combination of administrative competence and casual condescension he had been refining for 20 years. He was a large man, barrel-chested, with hands that had never done a day of physical labor and a manner that suggested this was something to be proud of. He looked at Ingrid Voss the way men like him always looked at women like her, seeing the widowhood, the plain dress, the absence of a man beside her, filing all of it under a category that required no further investigation. Mrs. Voss. He adjusted his spectacles. I was sorry to hear about your husband. What can I do for you today? Ingrid placed Eric's survey map on his desk. Her finger traced contour lines of Stoneback Ridge to a parcel above the tree line on the north slope. I want to buy this land. Cott leaned forward. His eyebrows moved toward his receding hairline. He looked at the map, then at her, then back at the map. The north slope above the tree line? That parcel, ma'am, is the most useless land in this county. The sun doesn't touch it for half the year. Snow drifts 20 feet deep against that slope every winter. Nothing grows there. Nothing lives there. That, Ingrid said, is precisely why I want it. Cott leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight. He saw a grieving widow grasping at whatever eccentric notion had taken root in her grief. And he saw an easy transaction on a parcel that had sat on the county books for 15 years without a single inquiry. It's yours for assessed value, he said. $22. Ingrid counted out the bills and laid them on his desk one by one. Cott stamped the deed with a flourish that suggested he was doing her a significant favor, then called to his clerk without lowering his voice. Make a note of today's date. When we find her body up on that slope. I don't want anyone saying I didn't warn her. Ingrid folded the deed and placed it in her coat pocket. She collected Petra from the chair in the corner where the girl had been sitting quietly, and she walked out of the land office without a word. That evening, Cott told the story at the saloon. He made it sound like comedy, which it was to everyone who heard it, because everyone who heard it had already made up their minds about the Norwegian widow who wanted to live on the north slope of Stoneback Ridge, where the sun refused to go. The first time Ingrid saw the cave, she understood everything. It opened in the mountainside behind a screen of scrub pine and mountain laurel, narrow at the entrance, perhaps 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall, but expanding dramatically beyond that initial compression, the way a held breath releases into something larger than expected. She lit a lantern and stepped inside, Petra's hand in hers, Bjorn padding silently behind. The dog's gray fur caught the lantern light as they moved deeper. The main chamber stopped her breath. Larger than Eric's notes had suggested. 35 feet deep, 25 feet wide, with a ceiling that rose to 12 feet at its highest point. The walls were natural granite, grace, solid, sculpted by water that had moved through here long before any living person's memory. The floor was level, carpeted with decomposed organic matter that would serve as the foundation for garden beds. At the far end, bubbling up crack in the rock with a sound like quiet conversation, was the spring. Ingrid knelt beside it and dipped her fingers into the water. Warm, not hot. Warm, the temperature of blood, fed by heat from deep within the earth, constant as a heartbeat, indifferent to the season above. She lifted her hand and watched the water run from her fingers in the lantern light. The thing she felt in that moment had no word in English. But she had known the Norwegian one since childhood, the feeling of recognizing a truth you had carried all along, without the language to name it. She began to cry, not the grief that had been with her for 3 weeks. Something different. Something that arrived with the specific weight of understanding what her husband had given her, what it had cost him to finish giving it, Mama. Petra's voice was barely above a whisper. The girl stood at the entrance to a narrow passage leading deeper into the mountain, her eyes wide in the lantern light. There are fish. Ingrid rose and followed her daughter through the passage. It opened into a second chamber, smaller but remarkable. A pool 8 foot across and 4 feet deep, fed by the same geothermal spring. In that pool, visible in the lantern light, the silver flash of rainbow trout, native fish that had found their way into this underground sanctuary through passages too narrow for any human instrument to map. Beyond the pool, the passage widened into a third space. The floor was covered with rich, dark soil warm to the touch. The air was humid, sweet, like a greenhouse in early spring, like something growing that had no reason to be growing here, in the dark, in the mountain. Ingrid placed her palm flat against the warm soil and felt the heat rising from below. Steady, generous. The earth giving what it had without being asked. She returned to the main chamber and knelt beside her daughter. Petra's eyes were wide, taking in the stone walls, the bubbling spring, the fish she had glimpsed through the passage. She was 6 years old, and she did not yet have the capacity for the full weight of what she was seeing, but she felt it. Children always feel the weight before they have the words for it. Ma, Petra said. Is this our new home? Ingrid pulled her close and held her in the warm dark. Yes, she said. This is what your father found for us. This is where we will be safe. That night, sleeping in the cabin for one of the last times, Ingrid opened Eric's journal to a page she had read before, but now understood differently. It was dated 3 months before his death, written in his careful engineer's hand. She read it slowly, each line carrying weight she had not been ready to receive until now. Build it big enough for neighbors, Ingrid. They will come. Pride always breaks before cold does. Make sure the door is wide enough. She read that last part 3 times. She closed the journal and looked out the window toward the mountain in the darkness. She made a second promise to her husband, not in words, but in the silence of a decision made alone about the kind of woman she intended to be. Construction began in May when the last snows had melted from the lower slopes. Ingrid worked from first light until she could no longer see, with Fjell and Bjorn for company, Petra helping where a 6-year-old could help, carrying small tools, fetching water, sitting near her mother with those quiet, watchful eyes that missed nothing. She hired one man from town to assist with the heaviest work, Ned Hollis, strong-backed and willing, who worked alongside her for 4 days before Silas Drummond found out about it. Silas Drummond was the master carpenter and builder of Harlow Creek. He had built half structures in Carbon County over 28 years and carried that history with him the way some men carry a title. He was 48 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands like hardwood and a voice that filled whatever room he stood in. He was not a cruel man by his own accounting. He was a practical man, a man who knew what was sound and what was foolishness dressed up as ambition. What Ingrid Voss was doing on the north slope of Stoneback Ridge was, by his accounting, the clearest case of dangerous foolishness he had witnessed in nearly 3 decades of building. He went to Ned Hollis on the 5th morning. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply explained, in the measured tone of a man who controlled the flow of work in a county, that any laborer associated with the Mole Woman's project on Stoneback Ridge would find himself unavailable for the contracts that actually mattered. The mill expansion, the new homes going up on Elk Street, the bank addition Cott had commissioned for the following spring. He explained this once, clearly. Then he left Ned Hollis to do the arithmetic. Ned Hollis collected his final day's wages from Ingrid that afternoon. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped she understood. He said, his eyes not quite meeting hers, "Good luck, Mrs. Voss. You're going to need it." Ingrid watched him go. Then she picked up her tools and went back to work. She would not learn for years exactly what Silas had said to Ned Hollis. When she finally learned, when Silas told her himself in the shelter on a night when the temperature outside was 52 degrees below zero, she had already been working alone for 3 months, and the work was nearly done. What Silas never told anyone, not until 1930, not until he was 90 years old and trying to leave something honest behind him, was what he had felt in those 3 months of watching Ingrid Voss work alone on the mountain. It was not guilt. Guilt arrives quickly and wants to be discharged. This was something slower, something that watched him from the edges of his sleep and did not announce itself by name. He had a gift for ignoring such things. He had spent decades perfecting it. What he could not ignore was what happened when his youngest son disappeared. Owen Drummond was 12 years old, the youngest of Silas's 2 boys. Different from his brother in ways Silas had never quite known how to address. Harlan Jr. was loud, certain, his father's son in every visible way. Owen was quiet. Owen noticed things. Owen spent his afternoons in his father's work not making noise, but watching the angles and the joints and the load distributions, absorbing the principles behind the craft rather than the craft's surface appearances. In the second week of June, Owen began vanishing after his chores were done. Silas assumed the creek, the other boys, the ordinary business of summer. He did not investigate. He had a mill expansion to supervise. What Owen was actually doing was standing at the tree line below the entrance to Ingrid Voss cave and watching her work. He had gone up the mountain on a dare, touched the entrance of the Mole Woman's den and run. He had done the first part. He had not done the second, because when he reached the entrance and saw what was actually there, the timber framing, the mortared stone, the calculated precision of every joint and angle, he forgot entirely about running. He came back the next day, the day after that. On the fourth day, Ingrid saw him at the tree line and said nothing. She continued her work. She let him watch. On the fifth day, she looked up from the iron pipe she was fitting into the stone channel and spoke without stopping her hands. "You can come closer. I don't bite." Owen stepped out from the tree line. He walked to the entrance and examined the timber framing with the deliberateness of someone who had spent years in a carpenter's workshop without knowing he was being educated. He ran his hand along a joint. He looked at the load-bearing angles of the entrance tunnel. "The angles are true," he said. "Yes, the joints are tight." He moved along the frame, examining. "My father builds good houses, but I never seen joints cut this tight." He paused where the timber met the mortared stone, studying the integration. He'd say this is overbuilt. "But I don't think it's overbuilt. I think it's right." Ingrid set down her pipe fitting and looked at the boy. He had his father's jaw, his father's hands, already showing the capable squareness that would find them in another decade. But his eyes were something else entirely. His eyes were the eyes of someone who looked at a thing and wanted to understand how it worked, rather than what it said about him. "Would you like to see inside?" she said. Owen's face opened the way a child's face opens when given permission for something it had wanted badly, but had not known how to ask for. He followed her inside. From that day forward, Owen came whenever he could slip away from his father's notice. He helped carry water. He tended the garden beds, taking shape along the south wall of the cave. He played with Petra, teaching her to skip flat stones across the surface of the fish pool, counting the skips with a seriousness that made her laugh. He asked questions, endless, precise, patient questions about the engineering of the water system, the thermal properties of granite, the calculations in the journals that Eric had left behind. Ingrid answered every question. She saw in this boy the same hunger she had seen in Eric, the hunger to understand the world as it actually was, rather than as people had agreed to say it was as. One afternoon in late July, Owen sat near the spring and watched the water move through the iron pipe system. "My father says underground houses are for savages," he said, not as a cruelty but as information he was genuinely attempting to examine. Ingrid was mortaring a stone channel. She didn't look up. "What does that thermometer say?" "Owen, read it." 56 degrees. What's the temperature outside right now?" He considered. "Maybe 40. The frost last night killed the garden at our house." "So which is warmer?" Ingrid said, setting down her trowel. "The savage's den or your father's civilized house?" Owen grinned, quick, genuine, the kind that changed his whole face. "The den." Ingrid looked at him directly. "When people mock what they don't understand," she said, "the truth is always in the numbers. Remember that." An old man named Arvid Ness had come to Harlow Creek in 1854 when it was nothing but a trading post and 3 log structures at a creek crossing. He was 74 years old now, white-haired and stooped, walking with a carved stick of mountain ash. His mind was sharp and his memory reached back farther than almost anyone alive in the county. He had heard enough of what people were saying about Ingrid Voss to recognize, from a third-hand description, what she was building. He walked up the mountain to see it himself on a warm afternoon in September, stopping twice to rest his back, but not his intention. He stood at the entrance to the shelter and looked inside. When he spoke, his voice carried something thin and fragile in it, the way old voices carry things when they have been surprised by something they thought was permanently lost. "I haven't seen one of these since I was very young," he said. He moved through the entrance into the main chamber. He examined the water system with hands that remembered the touch of similar things from a time before the territory had a name most people recognized. He looked at the garden beds, already green in late September. He watched the trout in the fish pool. "My grandfather had something like this," he said, "in the mountains far north. We survived a terrible winter in a shelter like this one. A winter that killed half our neighbors who refused to leave their houses above ground." He touched the stone wall as if greeting something. "Will you tell them, the people in town?" Ingrid looked at him. Would they listen? Arvid met her eyes. He had seen a great deal of human stubbornness in 74 years. They would not listen to an old man any more than they listen to you. But when the time comes, when the storm comes, they will see. Then they will remember everything they said. He put his hand briefly on her arm. "You are doing the right thing, Mrs. Voss. This is wisdom. This is what survival actually looks like before everyone agrees to call it wisdom." He walked back down the mountain slowly, leaning on his stick. Ingrid watched him go from the entrance of the shelter she had built with her husband's calculations and her own hands. Adelaide Fitch came on a cool October morning when the aspens had turned and the first frost had painted the grass silver. She came alone, driving a small buggy, without the knowledge of her husband. She brought a basket of fresh bread and preserved fruit. She stood at the entrance to the shelter and called out softly, not wanting to intrude. Ingrid invited her inside. Adelaide Fitch was 40 years old, the wife of Cornelius Fitch, the wealthiest man in Harlow Creek. Cornelius had made his fortune in land and timber, and now occupied a Victorian house on the valley floor that had cost $4,800 to build and furnish. A figure Cornelius mentioned the way some men mention their height as a baseline fact about the kind of person they were. Adelaide had lived in that house for 18 years. She was tired in ways the house had not created, but also could not repair. She stepped inside the shelter and stopped. Her hand went to her mouth. The main chamber was warm in the lantern light. The garden beds along the south wall were thick with vegetables, impossibly green in October, impossible by any reasoning she had ever been given. The fish pool sparkled. Petra sat near the cast-iron stove, practicing letters on a small slate. Bjorn asleep at her feet. The air smelled of earth and growing things, of warmth that had no business existing on the north slope of a Wyoming mountain. "It's beautiful," Adelaide said. Her voice was quiet with something like wonder. "It's nothing like what they say. It's not dark or frightening or damp." She looked around at the stone walls, the steady warmth, the peaceful child doing her lessons by firelight. "It's like somewhere safe. Somewhere genuinely safe, which I didn't know still exists." She pressed a small purse into Ingrid's hands, $14 from the household account taken without Cornelius's knowledge. She pressed something else into her hands as well, a small brass compass with a card attached by a string, on which Adelaide had written her home address. Careful script. "My husband doesn't know I've taken this money," Adelaide said. "Use it for whatever you need. If you ever need anything else, send word." Ingrid looked at the money. She looked at the compass. "Why?" she said. Adelaide's eyes moved around the chamber one more time. The warmth, the running water, the child doing her lessons, all of it existing in defiance of every assumption the town had made. "Because my husband's house cost $4,800, she said quietly, "and I have never once in 18 years felt sheltered in it." She looked before Ingrid could respond. Ingrid stood in the entrance and watched the buggy move down the mountain road. Adelaide's small figure growing smaller against the gray October sky. Then she looked at the compass in her hand. She turned it until the needle settled north. She took a small card from her work table and wrote on it carefully. The compass bearing from town to the shelter entrance, the landmarks along the route, the distance in miles. She attached the card to the compass by a length of string, set it back on the shelf near the spring. She would return it to Adelaide when the time came. When Adelaide would need it more than Ingrid did, the card would already be written, already waiting. There was a betting book kept at Coppernail Saloon, and Harlan Drummond Jr. served as its unofficial keeper. 20 years old, loud with his father's certainty, already practicing the performance that would define him among the men of Harlow Creek for the next decade. The book had been running since July, growing thicker through the summer as the Mockery settled into something more organized, more communal. In 10 to 1, the roof collapsed hot before Christmas. 20 to 1, her body would be found in the spring. 50 to 1, she crawled back to town before the first snow. The money flowed easily because it was not really gambling. It was putting numbers to a conclusion everyone had already reached. In the second week of October, Cornelius Fitch walked into the Coppernail and asked for the book. He took from Harlan Jr., opened it to a fresh page, wrote in a careful hand, handed it back. $100, he said, loud enough for the room. $100 at 20 to 1 odds. She freezes before Christmas. The room cheered. Men raised their glasses. What no one in the Coppernail knew, what Cornelius himself did not yet know, because he had not come home early enough that afternoon, was that his wife had spent that same afternoon inside the shelter he had just bet against. That she had stood in the warm chamber, that she had never felt sheltered in his house. That she had pressed $14 into the hands of the woman he had just wagered would be dead by Christmas. Beatrice was at the kitchen table when Cornelius came home that night, flushed from the saloon and pleased with himself. He told her about the bet, the way men tell their wives about amusing things, expecting the small indulgence. Adelaide smiled and said nothing that required a response. Later that night, in the dark, she lay beside her husband and listened to the wind beginning to move through the high country above the valley. The house creaked. The windows rattled in their frames. Somewhere above the ceiling, a draft worked its way through a gap that the expensive contractor had never managed to properly seal. She thought about the brass tap and the wand run freely in the warm stone chamber. She thought about the thermometer reading 56 degrees in a place that had no logical right to be warm. She thought about the compass on Ingrid's shelf with the card already written, already waiting. She thought about all the things she had felt in that shelter, all the things she had never felt in 18 years of sleeping in a $4,800 house. She made a decision. She did not speak it aloud. She simply made it in the dark beside her husband, who did not know it was being made. By the end of August, the shelter was complete. Total cost, $193. Ingrid walked through it on the last evening of August with a lantern and Eric's journal open in her hand, moving from the entrance tunnel to the main chamber, to the fish pool, to the garden beds, to the stable alcove, where Fjell stood with patient eyes, checking each element against the calculations Eric had made. The water system flowing perfectly, pressure maintained by the elevation of the spring source above the outlet. The garden beds green and abundant. The fish pool with 24 trout, healthy, their silver sides catching the lantern light. 8 hens in the side alcove, their body heat adding to the warmth rising from the earth itself. The double-door airlock, solid oak, heavy, well-fitted. 6 inches of separation between the world's cold and the shelter's warmth. She sat down in the main chamber with her back against the warm stone and the journal in her lap and looked at what her husband had imagined and she had built. $193. 3.5 months. Every callus on her hands, every aching morning, every evening she had worked past full dark. Every day she had done it alone after Silas Drummond had taken her last helper away. She opened the journal to the final page. Eric's handwriting was shaky at the end, the fever he had been hiding making itself visible in every letter, but the words were still clear. I only pray I have time to build it. He had not had time, she had. She looked at the spring bubbling at the far end of the chamber, steady and warm, endlessly patient. She looked at the vegetables growing in October, in a place where nothing was supposed to grow. She looked at the stone ceiling above her, 10 feet of granite and mountain, and thought about what was on the other side. The high Wyoming sky, the first cold stars of autumn, the wind beginning to move through the passes. Something was coming. She knew it the way Eric had known things, not from feeling, but from numbers. From the barometric readings she had been recording since spring with the instrument he had left her, a precisely calibrated aneroid barometer mounted on the cave wall where the temperature was stable. From the patterns in 7 years of his measurements, the numbers said something was coming that this valley had not seen in living memory. The numbers said the shelter she had just finished was going to matter in ways that no one in Harlow Creek would believe until it was too late to matter whether they believed it or not. Petra was asleep in the small room Ingrid had built against the back wall, tucked under 2 blankets. Bjorn lay at the foot of the bed. Through the wall, Fell moved quietly in his stable. Ingrid looked at her daughter sleeping and felt the full weight of the promise she had made, kneeling in the frozen earth of a hillside grave. The promise to build it. The promise to keep Petra safe. She had kept the first promise. She closed the journal. She blew out the lantern. In the darkness, the spring kept talking in its low, patient voice. Water running warm from deep in the earth, unchanged by seasons, unmoved by whatever was gathering in the sky above the mountain. Outside, far below, the lights of Harlow Creek glittered in the valley like a handful of scattered coins, each and one burning with the particular confidence of people who have not yet been shown the specific shape of their error. Inside the mountain, Ingrid Voss sat in the dark and waited for winter. The morning of December 27th arrived with the abruptness of a verdict delivered after a long deliberation. Ingrid knew before she touched the outer door. She knew from the quality of the silence, which changed overnight in ways that required no instrument to measure. For 9 days, the silence inside the shelter had been the silence of something holding against pressure, walls being tested, stone resisting, warmth defending itself inch against a world determined to take. This silence was different. This was the silence of pressure released, of a thing that had been gathering itself for a long time, finally spent. She worked through 6 feet of accumulated was successful for 40 minutes. Then she stepped out. The sky was a pale crystalline blue, so clear and cold and absolute that looking at it directly caused a physical ache after 9 days of stone ceiling and lantern light. The sun sat low on the southern horizon, throwing shadows across the snow that were longer than any shadows she had seen, the world compressed, strange, remade. Below her, Harlow Creek emerged from the white in shape she had to interpret before she could recognize. A roofline here, a chimney top, portions of structures visible above drifts that had swallowed everything else without apology. The water tower was a twisted catastrophe of iron rising above the snow line, its destruction so complete that the shape of what it had been was no longer apparent. The church stood with its steeple. The copper nail was a hollow shell, its roof caved through, its interior open to the January sky. The Fitch house on the corner of Elk and Main still had its walls, but every window was a dark vacancy. And the snow that had entered through those vacancies had filled the elegant rooms and frozen solid, turning them into ice sculptures of themselves. 29 people stepped out of the mountain behind Ingrid, one by one into the pale December morning. They stood at the entrance to the shelter and looked down at what remained of the town they had lived in. No one spoke. The cold was still severe, 15 below zero, but the wind was gone. The sky was open. And for the first time in 9 days, it was survivable in the specific way that survivable means something different after you have stood close enough to its opposite to feel its temperature. Dr. Phineas Marsh stood at the back of the group, his bandaged hands held against his chest, his cracked spectacles catching what light there was. He looked at the valley for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice held none of the authority he had spent 30 years constructing. We would have died. He said it simply, as a fact that required stating before anything else could be said. All of us in this group, every single one, if not for this place. A pause during which the wind moved once across the ridge and then stilled. If not for her? Nobody argued with him. Silas Drummond stepped forward. He had been preparing something since the night he arrived, working it over in the slow, methodical way that Silas Drummond worked over everything, turning it, examining it from different angles, rejecting the versions that were insufficient, returning to it again in the early hours when the shelter was quiet. 5 days of sitting against one stone wall, watching Ingrid move through the work of keeping 29 people alive, had given him time to understand what the thing needed to be. Not an explanation, not a defense, not the careful hedging of a man trying to preserve something of his prior position. Just the truth, stated plainly, without the armor he had worn so long he had forgotten it was armor. He stood in front of Ingrid on the slope below the shelter entrance in the cold December morning with the destroyed valley behind him and 28 surviving people arranged in a rough arc that no one had organized, but everyone had naturally formed. He looked at the timber frame of the entrance. He looked at it with the eyes of a master carpenter, not the eyes that had dismissed it 9 months before, but the eyes he had now, the eyes that Owen had always possessed, and that 9 days in this place had finally returned to the father. The angles, he said, quietly enough that the words were almost private. The load distribution. The way she integrated natural stone with timber framing. He ran his hand along a beam joint Ingrid had cut and fitted in the heat of July, working alone the day after Ned Hollis had come to collect his final wage. This is the finest construction I have ever seen, finer than anything I've built, finer than anything I knew how to build. He turned to face her directly. She stood with Petra beside her, the girl's hand in hers, Bjorn at her other side, wearing the practical dress she had worn every day of construction, every day of the winter, every day of the 9-day siege. Her face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who has been doing necessary work without pause, but her eyes were clear, steady, entirely themselves. I gave you the name they used, Silas said. I said you were digging your own grave and your daughter's. I went to Ned Hollis myself and threatened his livelihood to make him leave you alone on that mountain. When my youngest son lay dying on the mountain road, unable to walk another foot, I found a map in my coat pocket. His voice broke at the edges, but he continued through it. A map Owen had drawn himself from everything he'd learned here in this place, from you, while I was occupied being certain I was right. The wind came again and settled. I built coffins, he said. 28 years of work, and I built coffins. Yours is the only structure standing in this valley that held. It held because it was built from something I didn't have the willingness to let that this itself, and what it was actually offering instead of what I wanted it to be. He went down on one knee in the packed snow. I was wrong about all of it, about you, about this shelter, about every name I called you and every laugh I led. My wrongness cost this town 18 lives. It cost my son 3 fingers. It nearly cost him everything. I have no right to ask your forgiveness, but I am asking it anyway because it is the only honest thing I have left. Cornelius Fitch moved to stand beside him. He knelt without deliberateness, not the gesture of a man making a statement, but the involuntary movement of one whose body had decided that standing was no longer the appropriate posture. Then Dr. Marsh, his bandaged hands making the motion awkward. Then Mayor Harlan Cott, slowly, his frame protesting what the weeks had done to it. Then others, the men and women who had laughed in the market square, who had nodded along to the doc's pronouncement about poisonous vegetables, who had placed their coins in the betting book with the comfortable ease of people certain they were on the right side of history. 28 people in the snow, before the entrance of a cave that had cost $193 to build. Ingrid looked at them for a long moment. The morning sun was on her face, and in her free hand she held Eric's journal, carried out without thinking about it, the way you carry the thing that's been your bathroom pen through everything without deciding to. Get up, she said. All of you. They rose. 18 of our neighbors are dead. Her voice was even in the cold morning air. The Calloway children in their beds. Reverend Morse, 30 feet from his own door. Winifred Oakes with her Bible in her lap. Others we will find when the snow releases them in spring. 18 people who did not have to die. She let that sit for the length of time it needed to sit. This is not a time for kneeling. My husband did not spend 7 years searching for this place so that people could kneel in front of it. He fianced on it so that people could live. She looked out over the valley and then back at the people before her. I will teach you everything I know, everything in these journals. How to build with the land instead of against it. How to find the heat the earth gives freely. How to keep water flowing when every pump in this valley has frozen solid. She held up the journal. Eric Voss spent 7 years writing this down for this valley, for this town. For all of you, though none of you knew it. He could not tell you himself. A pause. Now we use it. Silas straightened. Where do we start? Ingrid looked at him, the man who had been her adversary for 9 months, who had driven away her workers, who had left the laughter and the betting and the quizzical cruelty of people who mistake certainty for knowledge. She looked at him and saw what he was now, which was different from what he had been. A craftsman who had been shown something he had not known, who had the honesty and the capacity to receive it. We start, she said, by understanding what we did wrong. Then we build something better. The reconstruction of Harlow Creek began Fallon the following spring, when the snow finally released the valley and revealed the full accounting of what the storm had taken. Cornelius Fitch sold everything. The salvage from his ruined house, the imported chandelier shipped to a hotel in Denver, the mahogany furniture's auction piece, the silver and china and carpets, ordered to cash with the deliberateness of a man shedding weight he has carried too long. He committed every dollar to the rebuild. He worked alongside laborers and carpenters with hands that had never held anything heavier than a pen, his soft palms blistering and slowly toughening. He made no decisions about construction without consulting Ingrid, and he did not argue with her answers. When anyone asked about his house, he told the full story, all of it, without softening. He had bet $100 that she would free. He had held his pride above his wife's safety for 6 days, while Adelaide stood at the kitchen table looking at a brass compass and begged him to use it. He told it that way every time because he had concluded that the only honest use of a humiliation of that magnitude was to let it be fully seen, so that other men might recognize the shape of it before the cold came for them. Silas Drummond became Ingrid's student in the way that serious craftsmen become students, completely, without reservation, setting aside decades of assumption and beginning again from what was actually true. He and Owen worked through Eric's journals page by page. What Silas could not follow in the engineering calculations, Owen explained to him, because Owen had been learning it for months and carried it in his hands the way young people carry things absorbed at exactly the right moment in their development. Between them, father and son, They built what Silas could not have built alone. The first earth shelter home in Harlow Creek that belonged to a family other than Ingrid's. By the end of 1889, 5 earth shelter homes stood on the slopes around Harlow Creek. By 1891, 10. By 1893, 15. Each one built on the principles Eric had derived from his grandfather's knowledge and refined with an engineer's precision for the specific geology of Carbon County. They called the method Voss building. The phrase that had been a cruelty became something else entirely. To pull a Voss no longer meant to do something foolish. It meant to apply the wisdom of what was actually true when the fashionable answer had failed. It meant listening to the land rather than arguing with it. It meant the specific intelligence of a person who looks at what is genuinely there and builds accordingly, regardless of what the people around them think about. Harlan Drummond Jr., 20 years old, 3 fingers permanently numb on his right hand, became the keeper of the betting book's final page. The page with his own handwriting, 20-1. She freezes before Christmas. He mounted it under glass in the Harlow Creek Town Hall, where it remained for decades. When anyone asked about his hand, he held it up without embarrassment. "This is what pride costs," he said every time. "Don't forget it." Arvid Ness lived to see 5 of the new shelters are completed. He walked to each one with his carved stick and examined the construction with the hands of a man who remembered such things from long ago, before the territory had roads or a name most people recognized. He declared each one worthy. He died in the winter of 1891 at the age of 77 in a small earth shelter home that Owen Drummond had helped him build on the edge of town. Ingrid sat with him in his final hours. His last words, spoken quietly with his eyes on the stone ceiling above him. "You brought something back that the world thought it had finished with. That is the greatest kind of work there is." Owen grew up inside the journals. By 16, he could reproduce Eric's thermal calculations from memory. By 18, he supervised construction independently. By 25, he had built 30 earth shelter homes across 3 Wyoming counties and into Colorado. And engineers from Denver were making the journey to Harlow Creek to understand why what he built worked when conventional structures in the same climates failed. He became the living transmission of everything Eric had written, carrying it forward into a world that was slowly, and with considerable resistance, beginning to understand that the engineer had been right. Adelaide Fitch recovered fully. The frostbite left no permanent damage. The hypothermia left no lasting physical effect, though she was a different woman afterward in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. She and Cornelius had 2 more children, both born in the earth shelter home Cornelius built with his own hands on the slope above the valley, not the most skilled construct ever raised on that mountain, but the most honest. Every joint a testament to a man who had learned, finally, the difference between the cost of a thing and its value. Bjorn died in the winter of 1905 at the age of 17 in his usual spot beside the cast iron stove. He had kept watch through every winter, growing from a young dog into an ancient one in the warmth of the shelter he had helped guard from the beginning. They buried him near the entrance where he had stood so many times with his hackles raised against whatever the night was carrying. Owen carved the marker from a flat river stone, Bjorn, guardian of the mountain. He kept watch over all who sheltered here. Flell outlived him by 2 years, dying in the spring of 1903 at the extraordinary age of 28 in the warm stable still attached to the original shelter. Petra's children tended him in his final years, bringing him apples in summer, braiding wildflowers into his mane in a ceremony they had invented themselves and maintained without anyone asking them to. His marker, also carved by Owen. Fiel, faithful companion. He helped build our home. Petra grew up in the shelter and in the valley, and in the knowledge her father had gathered and her mother had built around. She had Eric's watchful eyes and Ingrid's quality of attention, the ability to look at a thing and see what was genuinely there. In 1910, a young engineer named Thomas Aldrich arrived from Denver and circled, having heard stories of the Voss shelter and wanting to understand its construction. He stayed 3 weeks asking questions, then stayed another week because of Petra. They married in 1911 and had 3 children, all of whom learned the Voss methods from their grandmother. On the winter evenings when the stove was warm and the spring talked softly at the far end of the chamber, and Ingrid opened the journal and began. In 1919, the University of Wyoming sent a research team to Harlow Creek. They arrived with modern instruments, precision thermometers, flow meters, soil chemistry equipment, cameras with flash powder for the interior photographs. They spent 3 weeks measuring everything Eric had measured 30 years before with cruder tools, checking his numbers against their own. Eric Voss's calculations were accurate to within 2%. The research report, published in 1921, stated its conclusions without embellishment. The Voss Earth shelter design was 85% more energy efficient than conventional construction of the period. It maintained stable temperatures in all seasons without mechanical intervention. It provided superior protection against extreme weather events of any type or duration. The principles, the report noted, were ancient, practiced in northern regions for centuries before being gradually abandoned in favor of construction methods that prioritized appearance over function. Eric Voss had not invented them. He had recovered them, refined them with an engineer's precision, documented them in a form the modern world could use. By 1925, Voss building had spread beyond Wyoming. Architecture schools had begun teaching earth shelter design as a legitimate discipline. The old ways had never stopped being true. They had only been forgotten by people who had decided that forgetting them was a form of progress. Ingrid Voss died on the 3rd of February, 1928. She was 78 years old. The end came in her sleep in the bed she had built with her own hands, in the room against the back wall of the main chamber, in the same place she had slept for 40 winters. The stove held its quiet fire. The spring talked in its low, patient voice. The brass tap was ready to give water to anyone who needed it. Outside, a light snow was falling, adding a few more inches to the insulating cover that had protected the mountain home through 40 Wyoming winters. Petra found her in the morning. Her mother's hands were folded over Eric's journal, the one he had pressed into her hands in the final hours of his fever, the one she had promised to honor. Her face held the expression of someone who has finished a long and important task and is satisfied with how it was done. Word went down the mountain to Harlow Creek. People made their way up in the cold February morning, some on foot, some by horse, some helped by younger family members. They came without organization, drawn by something that required no announcement. Every surviving resident of Harlow Creek who had been alive in December of 1888 made the journey. There were not many of them left. 40 years is a long time, and the people who had knelt in the snow outside the shelter entrance were old now, most of them, and some were gone. But those who could came. They came as they had come to the shelter in the blizzard without being told, because some things do not require an announcement. Owen Drummond, 52 years old, and the mayor of Harlow Creek, stood at the graveside on the hillside above the valley, beside the marker where Eric Voss had been buried 40 years before, and delivered the words he had been forming without knowing it since the morning his father carried him through the storm to a door that was open. They called her the Mole Woman, he said, his voice carried in the cold, still air. They said she was digging her own grave. They played bets on when her body would be found. He looked out at the gathered faces, old faces, mostly, with the specific quality of people who carry a particular knowledge about themselves, the kind earned rather than chosen. She did not freeze. She did not fail. She built something that held when everything else in this valley collapsed. Then she opened the door to the people who had mocked her, and he did not say a word about what they had cost her, not one word. He paused long enough for the mountain to be quiet around him. She spent the next 40 years teaching us and subs how to build so it would never happen again. He looked at the shelter entrance below the graveside, where the timber frame Ingrid had fitted and mortared alone in the summer of 1888 still stood, solid as the mountain it was part of. Her husband found this place, Owen said. He found it and documented it and left it in her hands because he understood something the rest of us took decades to learn, that she would do more with it than he ever could have. He was the engineer. A pause in which the only sound was the wind moving once across the ridge. She was the one who kept the door open. A bronze plaque was installed at the shelter entrance that same spring, cast in Denver, and brought up the mountain road when the ground was soft enough to work the mounting posts into the stone. The words on it were chosen by Owen and Petra together over several evenings in the warmth of the main chamber, with the spring talking quietly and the fish moving in the pool their mother had tended for 40 years. The Ingrid Voss, 1850-1928. They called her the Mole Woman. They wagered she would die. But when pride froze and the valley broke, she opened her door and saved 29 souls. She taught us that the wisest home is not built against nature, but within it. Here also rest Fjell and Bjorn, faithful companions who helped build this sanctuary and kept watch over all who sheltered here. In the winter of 1930, on a cold Wyoming afternoon, Silas Drummond sat on the porch of his son's house and came to the end of the story. He was 90 years old. His hands were still on his knees, the left hand whole. The right hand, Harlan's, with its permanent record of 50 feet and the cost of certainty, resting on the porch rail. The boy, 12 years old and entirely serious in the way of children who understand they have been told something that matters, sat still on the step below. She was right the whole time, the boy said. Not a question. Yes, Silas said, and you knew she was right. Silas considered this the way he had learned to consider things since the storm taught him what consideration was actually for. I knew something was wrong with what I thought, he said. That is not quite the same as knowing she was right, but it's where knowing she was right begins, if you're willing to follow it. He looked at his grandson. Most people aren't willing. Most people feel the first doubt and pushed back down because being wrong about something large means being wrong about themselves. That is the thing human beings are least able to bear. He looked at Harlan's hand on the rail. The cold doesn't care, he said. The storm that comes once in a generation doesn't care what you believe about yourself. It only cares about what you built and whether you built it honestly. He was quiet a moment. Your uncle's fingers don't argue with my pride. They're simply gone. He leaned forward slightly. What that woman understood, what it took 18 dead neighbors and a 9-day blizzard to teach me, is that preparation is not weakness. It is not fear. It is not the behavior of foreign people or frightened people or people who live in caves. His voice was low but entirely clear. It is the highest form of respect for a world that is older and stronger and far less patient than human pride has ever accounted for. The person who understands that, even when everyone around them is laughing, that person is not crazy. He sat back. Sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is the only one seeing clearly. He looked at the boy. Remember that, son? Whatever it costs you to remember it, because the storm always comes. When it does, the only thing that matters is what you built before it arrived, and whether you built it honestly. The snow fell. The mountain stood. On its north slope behind a screen of scrub pine and mountain laurel, the spring that Eric Voss had found in the autumn of 1887 continued running at 54 degrees, unchanged by seasons, unmoved by the passage of men and their opinions, and the long, expensive education of their certainties, patient as the earth itself, giving heat freely, giving water freely, asking nothing in return except that someone be wise enough to receive what was being offered.